Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for this special presentation, When Disaster Strikes, Creating Financial Resilience in the Aftermath of Natural Disasters. My name is Michelle Sloan-Jones, and I'm the Chief External Affairs Officer for MMI. I'm joined today by an esteemed group of colleagues, all of whom are consumer financial health experts, and I look forward to introducing them to you during our time together. First, I'd like to start with a quick rundown of our agenda. We will be kicked off today by MMI's President and CEO, Jim Triggs, then Kate Bulger, MMI's resident data and disaster recovery expert, will pick up the conversation to explain how increases in wildfires, hurricanes, and other natural disasters are affecting Americans' wallets, and why some groups are harder hit and have a harder time recovering. Then Jackie Boas, our Senior Director of Housing and Disaster Recovery Counseling, will explain how Project Porchlight has reached and helped so many of these people and share some lessons learned that we hope others will be able to make use of. Finally, we will close out with a Q&A. And for those of you joining via Zoom, we welcome your questions. You can use the Q&A feature. We'll answer them at the end of our presentation today or follow up with you afterwards. And with that, I'll turn it over to Jim.
Thank you, Michelle. Hello, I'm Jim Triggs. I'm the President and CEO of Money Management International. Our mission at Money Management International is to improve lives through financial education. At MMI, we provide debt relief, financial counseling, and free financial education programs and services. We help people in all walks of life repay debt, balance their budget, and find lasting financial peace of mind. Last year, we actually helped over 200,000 consumers find comfort and control over their finances. Today, we'll be focusing on an unfortunately growing segment of that work. We'll be talking about our support of the financial recovery and resilience of those who've been hit hard by hurricanes, floods, wildfires, and other natural disasters. MMI's Project Porchlight focuses on helping families and individuals affected by natural disasters develop and execute a personalized recovery plan, bringing them back to their pre-disaster normal as quickly as possible. Providing financial counseling and financial recovery and resilience relief in these historic times is a challenge unlike anything we've seen in our sector. This challenge is one that MMI is uniquely positioned to address through Project Porchlight. I look forward to sharing with you what we've learned through the development and delivery of Project Porchlight and about how best to support equitable, effective financial recovery following natural disasters. I do want to personally thank our amazing Porchlight funders, Fannie Mae and the MetLife Foundation, who have made this work possible completely free of charge to the consumers that we serve. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Kate Bulger.
Thanks, Jim, and hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. I'm here to talk to you a little bit about what it's like to recover from a disaster and what folks are facing. One of the big challenges, and you'll see it here, that we're seeing is that the regularity, the instances of natural disasters is on the rise significantly. So just last year, there were a record-breaking 22 separate billion-dollar weather and climate disasters in the United States, causing a combined $95 billion worth of damage. It is huge. And for a little context, when we look back to the 80s, 90s, the average number of disasters per year was just 7, which is still a lot, but significantly less than 22. One of the real challenges we have as well, if we can flip to next slide, is that we're seeing areas that are being hit by disasters so frequently that they don't have time to recover from one disaster before the next disaster strikes. These are these double dip disasters. And while there's lots of parts of the US that expect disasters to kind of happen with some regularity, there's some seasonality, right? Tornadoes tend to happen in the spring for the South and Midwest. We have fire season out west along the West Coast. There's hurricane season and folks on the Atlantic and in the Gulf. But this real escalation in the instance of disasters is making recovery from those things much, much more difficult. People find themselves struggling to recover, struggling to catch up. And we've got a couple of good examples, I think, just from last year. So we've got these back-to-back wildfires in California where folks are just beginning to rebuild when another fire is coming through and sweeping through their area. And then really tragically, Lake Charles in Louisiana last year. So they were first hit by Hurricane Laura, and then just a few weeks later, Hurricane Delta swept through. So folks had just begun to put up tarps, just begun to really find contractors and begin their rebuilding when all of a sudden they were damaged again. And recovery from one disaster is tough. Recovering from two disasters is incredibly more difficult. But there are a group of folks who are facing an even more uphill battle. If we can go to our next slide. Thanks. We've got these folks who are, really already facing a deck that's stacked against them. They've got these systemic inequities, that are already putting significant financial pressure on their situation. And a disaster really just exacerbates these things. So those same inequities, unfortunately, that are facing, folks who are people of color, women, people who are lower on the socioeconomic spectrum, those inequities continue to exist in the disaster recovery process. And so what functionally starts to happen is that the disaster takes an already difficult situation for these folks and significantly exacerbates it, and really makes it so much more difficult for them to really recover their lives and their livelihoods. We've got a couple of really tragic examples. So census areas that are majority Black, Latino, or Native American are 50% more vulnerable to wildfires. And so those folks are significantly more at risk. They're at risk of seeing not just one fire, but multiple fires. The women, the elderly, and minorities, and the very poor tend to be the groups who have the most unmet needs after a disaster. So that means that they receive some aid, they may receive insurance money, grants and assistance that comes through. But even with all of that together, that is still not enough assistance for them to rebuild. And so they're really stuck with few options to put their lives back together and regain their pre-disaster normal. In fact, research has shown that the lower someone is the lower someone's socioeconomic level, the less likely it is for them to ever get back to their pre-impact lifestyle. Low-income households are less likely to be prepared for natural disasters as well. It takes a real investment to evacuate when a disaster occurs. It takes investment to be able to prep your home for an immediate disaster, put paneling over windows, that kind of thing, and sort of more long-term planning, like putting hurricane ties on homes. All of that takes money that groups don't necessarily have access to right then. And the unfortunate thing is, we know that it doesn't have to be this way, right? And we know that because white individuals living in disaster impact counties grew their wealth by $126,000 following a disaster, while at the same time, Black and Latino people living in comparable areas lost $27,000 and $29,000 respectively. It is a huge difference, but it's also a difference that we can solve for. And so I'm actually going to pass you to Michelle to talk a little bit more about Project Porchlight for us.
Great. Thank you, Kate. So what we heard is that recovery from disaster is challenging in the best scenarios. It's exponentially more difficult if you're in an area that is hit by multiple disasters. And it's further compounded by inequities that make a full recovery less likely for minorities and people from less affluent households. But like you said, there is hope, there are solutions, there are ways to overcome this. And that's what we hope to demonstrate to you today, and it can be applied elsewhere, what we've learned through Project Porchlight that helps us and helps our clients bridge these gaps. Last year through Project Porchlight, we responded to over two dozen disasters, including those that caused more than $1 billion in damages, as well as many more smaller geographically contained events. Through proactive outreach and marketing campaigns, as well as through national and localized partnerships, we provided recovery counseling services to over 5,000 survivors in 13 different languages in 2020 alone. And so when we look at those client demographics of those that we served, from what we and many others have seen in past research and historical data, the clients that MMI is serving through Project Porchlight are reflective of those who are likely to have a tougher time recovering. And that's important, and I want you to keep that in mind when we look at our outcomes. Because what that says to me is that we are reaching the right people, and that what we have learned about how to effectively serve people is working, because we are seeing some really fantastic results despite these historical odds. Our Porchlight disaster recovery clients are majority minority. Only 21% identify as non-Hispanic Caucasian. This group that we're serving is also predominantly female, and 16% of those that we serve are military affiliated, which means they're either active duty, a veteran, or it's an immediate family member of someone who has or is serving in the U.S. Armed Forces. When we look at the household profile of those that we've served, 85% are renters, 69% are from low to moderate income households. And when they start working with us, they're reporting an average monthly budget deficit of $881. So now I want to bring in Jackie. And Jackie, have you talk with us about what we have seen in terms of the most common challenges to recovery, about what interventions you found to be the most effective. So let's start first with the challenges, Jackie, and we can advance to the next slide. What have you learned about the barriers that people face in the recovery?
So in conjunction with federal, state, and local authorities and our partners, we spent years developing the framework for supporting natural disaster victims. And we have identified what the most common challenges are. And I'll tell you a little bit about those. First of all, navigating the bureaucracy and red tape. Of course, you hear about that in any occasion where you have to fill out forms and go through processes like government processes. We hear from our consumers that it's incredibly difficult and challenging. Then there's also limited access to credit. We know that minorities and low to moderate income folks are most impacted in disasters, and many of them simply do not have access to credit. Also, scams. Yes, disaster victims are disproportionately targeted by scams. They also have trouble accessing the resources that they need. It may be something as simple as not having access to the internet to be able to apply for benefits or seek resources. Also, they have trouble prioritizing their debts and other financial obligations during this time. And working with a counselor helps them tremendously in just organizing and prioritizing those things. Trauma and stress hindering financial decisions is a real reality for someone who's been impacted by disaster. It is a struggle sometimes mentally just to cope, and making decisions is very, very heavy for them. Next one.
So Jackie, when your counselors are faced with those challenges, or the clients that they're serving are faced with those challenges, what are some of the interventions that you and your team have found to be the most effective as you work to help people break down some of these barriers?
So the first thing is approaching our disaster victim with a calm voice. I mean, the people that we're talking to are coming to us in all states of emotion. And so it takes a calm, soothing person to get them moving in the right direction. They also need devoted support from a single point of contact. We work very hard with Project Porchlight to ensure that from the first contact and the first counseling session, you're coupled with that same counselor throughout your program. They also need a really good assessment of the disaster impact and developing an action plan. So we need to know where they stand as far as recovery, or if they're still in evacuation mode. And then we need to create an action plan so that we're moving forward one step at a time towards that recovery. They also need assistance with FEMA and insurance claims. Those are some of the largest hurdles that we hear from consumers. Sometimes they're just so exhausted mentally that they can't even fathom filling out a FEMA application. And so our job is to help them progress through these things. And then there are denials, because unfortunately everything is not approved the first go around. So working with them if they get a FEMA denial, or if they're struggling with their insurance claim, is also part of our process. And then there's monthly support from their counselor. We're reaching out on a monthly basis to check in on their progress and make sure that they're moving forward with the action plan. And of course, we're there at any point. It doesn't have to be just monthly. At any point, they can communicate with their counselor and talk about next steps.
And Jackie, I know in hearing you talk about this over the years, that monthly support has been really key to helping people overcome some of the recovery fatigue. When you talked about, I just can't imagine filling out another form, or I submitted 5 pictures and they want one more, I just can't do it. That's where your coaches and counselors are able to hop in and say, I know it's so frustrating, but it's just one more picture and it's really going to make a difference. Let's do this together and make sure that it gets done. So
Absolutely.
I appreciate the time that's put into this, and also just the breadth of knowledge that folks need to have to be able to support people wherever they are in that recovery process, whether the disaster struck 10 days ago or whether it's a year and a half in the rearview mirror. So I think that is an undercurrent that we have seen run through all the services that your team provides as well. So taking it back to Kate, if we flip to the next slide, we're going to take a look at some of our results. Kate, share with us what you've seen.
Yeah, thank you so much. And this, as you well know, this is my very favorite part. This is where we look at our consumers who've participated in Porchlight that we've been supporting. We look at their long-term outcomes and measure the impact of Porchlight. So what we found is that 97% of the folks that we worked with were able to resume their monthly payments to creditors. This is important because it means that they have enough of their budget to resume payments. It means that they're able to get off of sort of the disaster relief programs. And it means that they are getting back into that financial normal. 93% have made on-time bill payments for at least 12 months. Again, this is huge. It shows that not only have they started making payments, but they have the stability, the financial stability to continue making those payments. They're taking what they've learned from Porchlight, they're making really good financial choices. 90% of them have successfully secured safe, affordable, permanent housing. One of the huge challenges in recovery is people having to move quite a bit, and having secured sort of more permanent housing that is affordable, that is safe, that is right for their family is so important to setting them up for long-term success. And then the big one. So what we see is a 25-point improvement in their FICO score. And typically after a disaster without intervention, these communities that we serve usually see a 25-point decrease in their credit score. And that really goes back to what I was talking about before, where these communities experience higher amounts of debt. They really struggle with their budget. The disaster leaves them $27,000 to $29,000, less wealth than they had walking into this disaster, less income and less wealth overall. Being able to improve their credit score after a disaster, it's hard to call a disaster a good thing. I would never go that far, but it does mean that disaster is becoming an inflection point, and they have been able to really use Porchlight and use the disaster assistance to make themselves better, which is more like what we see in the white communities that we studied, where we saw $100,000+ improvement. This also means that they have more borrowing power, which becomes really important in a disaster, the ability to borrow when you need it in order to make necessary repairs quickly can be the difference between a recovery that you're able to get through in a matter of months and a recovery that can drag on for years and be incredibly expensive. The other really big deal we see here is a 26% reduction in their debt to income ratio. And again, this goes back to their ability to make payments and their ability to really borrow when they need to, right? So that means that they've got a budget that allows them to pay down debt. It means that they are not taking on more debt than they need in order to recover, and that the debt that they are taking on, they're able to start paying it down really quickly right away. These are phenomenal results. They are so much better than I think any of us even dared to hope for. And I really think that they they show why it is so important for folks to have the kind of support that Porchlight provides, especially when we're looking at these really at-risk communities, communities of color, communities that have, sort of lower on the socioeconomic spectrum. And, while Porchlight certainly doesn't correct for all of the systemic inequities that affect these populations, it does correct for some of the systemic inequities that these communities face as they're trying to recover from a disaster. So it no longer becomes an exacerbation for them. So I'm incredibly proud of what we've been able to achieve here.
And Kate, I heard you hit on a couple of topics that we're going to see reflected in the next screen. So you talked about borrowing, you talked about prioritizing debts. Jackie, talk to us a little bit about what we see on this next slide here about the overall financial health of the clients that we've served.
So in addition to the outcomes, we monitor the financial health of our Project Porchlight clients, and we're using the Financial Health Network's FinHealth score. The FinHealth score looks at a range of financial health indicators, including spending, saving, borrowing, and planning. A healthy score indicates that someone is doing well across nearly all components of these categories. Coping is doing well in some areas, but has clear challenges in others. And vulnerable would indicate that someone is challenged across nearly all aspects of these 4 categories. Our clients, as you see, move up from vulnerable to coping, which is definitely moving in the right direction. But you see the biggest impact in moving from coping to healthy. Nearly half of all clients who were in the coping category when they came to us moved into the healthy range during the course of our work together, which is just tremendous in improving their financial health, but they're also just their well-being overall.
So Kate, what is most striking to you about this, what we see in the FinHealth scores and that impacts overall?
Yeah, absolutely. So being able to take someone who is struggling from a disaster and just trying to recover to their pre-disaster normal and moving them from feeling vulnerable about their situation to feeling, just feeling like they can cope with their situation, that is a huge win. It is a huge reduction in stress. It is really the difference between not being able to make your payments and being able to make your payments and not just think about money and recovery all the time. Importantly, it also means they're moving through their financial recovery more quickly. Folks who, are really struggling to make their basic, expenses to just put food on the table, they don't have the time or the bandwidth to think about recovering and rebuilding, and they can get stuck in this long recovery. One of the most important things here too is that it means that folks have to get into this kind of help, right? If we don't reach people, what we know is that their financial situation becomes worse. And so getting to them early in their disaster and getting them help when they need it is really key to making these changes and seeing this become a reality. Otherwise, we'll continue to see, unfortunately, the pattern that we see nationally, where areas that are hit by disaster are, increasingly facing more and more financial and economic hardship.
Great, thank you. So we are about to move into the Q&A segment of our talk today. So if you would go ahead and enter your questions into the Q&A field in your Zoom browser here. We have a couple of questions that have come in already. If we're not able to get to all of them today, we'll certainly follow up with you afterward. So I wanted, one of the questions that was in here today was, so given some of the challenges that we see of people who are even trying to live in a disaster area, the question is, how do we get in touch with clients and help and stay in touch to help them? Kate, do you maybe want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. This is where partnerships are critically important. So we know that there are local governments that are in touch with their communities. We know that there are financial institutions that are in touch with their consumers, but we also know that there's a number of, and those groups can refer people to us, and then we can help really get arms around them, get them help from their institution, get them help from their local government, and get them the support that Porchlight provides. But there's also a huge group of folks who are considered hard to reach typically. They're not reaching out to their financial institution. They're not picking up the phone when their local, community person calls. And for those folks, doing marketing work really makes a big difference. Trying to reach them through ads and having funders who can help us do that work is critical to reaching those folks.
So when we talked about tailoring services to reach those historically disadvantaged groups and helping them succeed, Kate, can you say a little bit more about that? Perhaps give an example. It's been asked, could you talk about, can you give an example of how services have been tailored or the outreach has been tailored to reach those hard to reach groups?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think a great example is what we saw in Puerto Rico earlier in early 2020. There were a series of pretty severe earthquakes that occurred. And so we had a great partner that allowed us to do marketing work to reach out, and that was absolutely critical. And so we were able to tailor our messaging to put it in Spanish, which was incredibly important for that population, but also really tailor the words that we used and the way that we talked about disaster recovery to talk about the challenges that folks were facing, because the challenges you face in an earthquake is not the same as the challenges that you're facing in, say, a fire or a tornado, right? Like these are really different disasters. And so that context can matter a lot.
Thank you. Jackie, we have a question here that I think you might best be able to answer for us. And the question is, on average, how long does a consumer work with your organization before recovery is reached?
So it certainly varies from consumer to consumer, depending on the type of disaster. Somewhere from 3 to 9 months is kind of typical. And then if you think about someone in Louisiana who last year got hit by both Laura and Delta and flooding, then that process is going to take much, much longer.
Sure. Which leads me to another question we saw in here around how have people who have lived through a disaster, did we work with people who had lived through a disaster to help inform our program? And I know you have firsthand experience with that, as does some of our fellow MMIers. So you want to talk a little bit about how direct experience with surviving and recovering from a disaster impacted what you put in place creating Project Porchlight?
Sure. When we were looking for the team that we wanted to develop for the program initially, we thought, we have a good variety of counselors who live in the Gulf Coast area and some other areas that have been impacted by disasters. And we thought, those folks will bring a unique empathy and knowledge of how to navigate in a disaster. And so that was the core team that we trained first. So most of those counselors live around the Gulf Coast. Almost every single one of them have been personally impacted by disaster. Some actually multiple times. We have counselors in Lake Charles who unfortunately have been displaced from their homes since last year, since Hurricanes Laura and Delta. So they bring their own personal knowledge of what it takes to navigate these waters to these kinds of disaster counseling sessions. And then I'll add on top of that, as we move along, despite their personal knowledge, we also have a fabulous training team who is constantly ensuring that we are up to date and that our team is trained and knowledgeable and that we know about the resources and all of the things that are available to help these consumers.
Thank you, Jackie. Let's see, we had a question come in around how should people be in touch if they need help today? Of course, you can always go to the moneymanagement.org website. Project Porchlight is featured on our site, and you'll find a toll-free number there that you can call to reach out for assistance, or that's also where you can read more about help if you know someone who needs help recovering from a disaster today. As we know, there are still people without internet and some without electricity on the Gulf Coast today from our most recent hurricanes. Let's see, we've got another question in here about implementing a disaster recovery program for employees or customers. And if you're thinking about implementing this type of program, what are some things to think about and just where do they start for that? Kate, you want to take that?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to. I think the first advice is don't wait to start right now. Just like having, a disaster recovery, plan is important for your business. Having a disaster recovery plan for your employees, for your consumers is important to put in place now ahead of the disaster. The last thing you want to do is be in a position where you're trying to react to a disaster and create a new partnership, right? Like that is more work than you certainly want to take on in the event of a disaster. So start now, start ahead. Really what we find is that reaching out to people right away, making sure they know about Porchlight before the disaster strikes, making sure that they know where to call and where to go for resources makes a huge difference. It saves time. They don't have to search around, and then making sure that we get word out as soon as a disaster strikes for folks who don't have things like Project Porchlight at top of mind. For a lot of folks, it is not turning to your employer for assistance in the immediate aftermath of a disaster is not kind of an instinctual first thing to do. And so, and same with turning to your financial institution. So having that in place and having an outreach plan in place is really important. I would also think about the types of events that you're likely to face. So if you are, out west, then what we want to do is really plan for things like fires that happen much more frequently on the West Coast. If your business or your constituents or your consumers are maybe located in the Gulf, then we really want to focus on creating a plan for folks who are impacted by hurricanes and flooding. And finally, we want to get as much prep out as possible. So helping folks understand things like, if you're in an area where flooding is possible, getting flood insurance ahead is super important, and how, flood insurance, regular homeowners insurance, for instance, doesn't cover flood damage. Making sure that they have that knowledge ahead of time is also really important. But my biggest advice is don't wait. Really start working on that plan right away. We are in the middle of hurricane season. We do expect hurricane season to continue to pick up. We typically see the most activity there late in season. So we're coming into that period now, unfortunately. So if you don't have a plan in place already, go ahead and make one today.
Great point. And when you were talking about having your materials and your plans together and ready to launch just after a disaster, that is some really great advice that we've seen play out in real time. And when you think about financial recovery, right after disaster, most people are focused on water, handing out water and food and shelter and clothing and that type of basic necessities. But one of the things that we came to learn is that getting that intervention for the financial recovery just on the heels of that is really important. And it starts much earlier than we anticipated, because there are mistakes that can be made in the process in those early weeks and months that can really ripple throughout the rest of their recovery. So being ready to go when disaster hits, it is important, and is when people are most likely to respond to outreach.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So I have a question in here about how much capacity does MMI and Porchlight have to expand the number of consumers served? And do we have plans to collaborate with other agencies to replicate this program and expand capacity that way? And I'm happy to take that one. So there are a couple of parts to that answer. One is that MMI maintains a level of capacity in both its call centers, which we operate 24/7 every day of the year, except for 2 when we close for a holiday, and have all of our services available in English and Spanish, and are able to support other languages through a language line. So having that infrastructure ready is a big part of our ability to respond. And having counselors who are trained across multiple types of issues also allows us to flex staff so that when a situation occurs, such as with Hurricane Ida last week, we have counselors who are experienced in working with housing issues. They're experienced in the direct aftermath of a disaster and are ready and prepared to respond to that. While we have other counselors who are continuing to work with consumers that they've been serving from events that happened back in 2020 that they're still supporting. In terms of collaborating with others, that is a big part of what we do. We collaborate with local nonprofits and other organizations on the ground in disaster areas in a couple of ways. One way is that we can supplement the work that on the ground organizations are providing. So if there's an on the ground organization that's there in person in the field, but they need backup from call center support, or they need after hours support, we can partner in that way. If they are providing one, if the on the ground organization is providing one type of assistance, but they want to supplement it with financial counseling that we provide, we're able to give them flyers, brochures, literature, digital resources that they can then use in their outreach to make people aware of the other types of assistance that are available there. Kate, what would you add? Anything you would add there about the collaboration with local, with other nonprofit agencies?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I think that one of the challenges that people doesn't usually float to top of mind for folks is that the same disaster that's impacting the consumers in an area, right, that impacts the employees of local nonprofits in that area. And so having, you know, if part of your disaster recovery plan is to really lean on and get support from those local agencies, that might not be something that they're ready to do right away. And so Porchlight can be a really nice bridge for folks to give those nonprofits and those nonprofit employees time to recover themselves and to, you know, recover personally, recover as a business, you know, and fill in that in-person, you know, fill in that gap until in-person services in the area are available again. You know, working really hand in hand with, the other thing is we work really hand in hand with disaster recovery case managers, long-term recovery case managers. And these are folks who really specialize in total recovery. They think about things like, how are we going to get you childcare so that you can go talk to this, you know, contractor, and then you got to have somebody on site to receive materials. They do this very, very hands-on in-person work, you know, but financial pieces really aren't their specialty usually, right? They're typically volunteer organizations that are really well trained in things like helping people work, you know, through the emotional trauma of an event, helping people, like I said, just, you know, receive materials, get kids back into school, that kind of thing. And so we partner closely with those organizations as well, so that we can take on that financial piece and work on the financial recovery and give them the bandwidth to do all of the rest of the recovery work that it takes to get somebody back to their total pre-disaster normal.
Thank you, Kate. And I think now perhaps will be a good time. Let's pivot to a few takeaways, because I know that's what people also always look for. What are the takeaways that you can apply in your own circumstance, your own businesses, your own communities to help people? You know, we know that a single catastrophic weather event can throw anyone into financial disarray. When back-to-back disasters occur, victims have little time in between events to recover. And without intervention, each subsequent disaster's effects become increasingly difficult to resolve. By providing financial counseling, people get access to support, tools, and education that puts them on a path to full financial recovery. And often these services reach people who would not have otherwise achieved this outcome. By making that type of resource available, survivors are able to borrow their counselor's skills and experience, helping them navigate a highly bureaucratic process that's often a barrier to recovery. And what's more, those skills that are learned can be applied long after the disaster subsides. So in a very real way, it is possible to leverage financial disaster protocols to alter the financial trajectory of people's lives for the better. So, you know, in addition to the data that we presented here, we share in more detail about some of the marketing efforts that were most effective at reaching hard to reach consumers in disaster prone areas. We also have feedback and testimonials from our counselors and other newly released findings from our work through Project Porchlight that can be found in our just published white paper, which can be found at the link on your screen, which is moneym.org/disaster support. We know that there is so much good that can be done when people have the right support to overcome financial challenges. In an age when natural disasters are expected to occur more often, with more intensity, and in more regions, building an infrastructure for financial recovery and resilience is essential to every community's overall health. So we are really proud to share our learnings from Project Porchlight to hopefully help replicate its success and reduce the longstanding inequities that are embodied in disaster recovery. If you have any questions for us or would like any additional information, you can always go to our website. As I mentioned earlier, moneymanagement.org/porchlight is where you can find more detail about Project Porchlight and disaster services, or you can email Thomas Nietzsche, our Director of Media and Brand, thomas@moneymanagement.org. Thank you to everyone who joined us today. A big thank you again to MetLife Foundation and Fannie Mae and our other partners who make this work possible. I wish you all well. Now let's all go and do some good in the world. Thank you.